A.3.5. What is Anarcha-Feminism? Although opposition to the state and all forms of authority had a strong voice among the early feminists of the 19th century, the more recent feminist movement, which began in the 1960s, was founded upon anarchist practice. This is where the term Anarcha-Feminism came from, referring to women anarchists who act within the larger feminist and anarchist movements to remind them of their principles. The modern anarcha-feminists built upon the feminist ideas of previous anarchists, both male and female. Indeed, anarchism and feminism have always been closely linked. Many outstanding feminists have also been anarchists, including the pioneering Mary Wollstonecraft, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, the communard Louise Michel, and the American anarchists and tireless champions of women's freedom, Voltairine de Cleyre and Emma Goldman. For the former, see her essays Sex Slavery, Gates of Freedom, The Case of Woman versus Orthodoxy, Those Who Marry Do Ill. For the latter, see The Traffic in Women, Woman Suffrage, The Tragedy of Women's Emancipation, Marriage and Love, and Victims of Morality, for example. Freedom, the world's oldest anarchist newspaper, was founded by Charlotte Wilson in 1886. Anarchist women like Virgilia D'Andrea and Rose Besotta played important roles in both the libertarian and labor movements. The Mujeres Libres free women movement in Spain during the Spanish Revolution is a classic example of women anarchists organizing themselves to defend their basic freedoms and create a society based on women's freedom and equality. See Free Women of Spain by Martha Ackelsberg for more details on this important organization. In addition, all the male major anarchist thinkers, bar Proudhon, were firm supporters of women's equality. For example, Bakunin opposed patriarchy and how the law, open quote, subjects women to the absolute domination of the man. He argued that equal rights must belong to men and women so that women can become independent and be free to forge their own way of life. He looked forward to the end of the authoritarian juridical family and the full sexual freedom of women, end quote. Thus, anarchism has, since the 1860s, combined a radical critique of capitalism and the state with an equally powerful critique of patriarchy, rule by men. Anarchists, particularly female ones, recognized that modern society was dominated by men. As Anna Maria Mazzoni, an Italian anarchist immigrant in Buenos Aires, put it, women, open quote, will find that the priest who damns you is a man, that the legislator who oppresses you is a man, that the husband who reduces you to an object is a man, that the libertine who harasses you is a man, that the capitalist who enriches himself with your ill-paid work and the speculator who calmly pockets the price of your body are men. Little has changed since then. Patriarchy still exists, and to quote the anarchist paper La Question Sociale, it is still usually the case that women, open quote, are slaves both in social and private life. If you are a proletarian, you have two tyrants, the man and the boss. If bourgeois, the only sovereignty left to you is that of frivolity and coquetry, end quote. Anarchism, therefore, is based on an awareness that fighting patriarchy is as important as fighting against the state or capitalism. For, open quote, you can have no free or just or equal society, nor anything approaching it, so long as womanhood is bought, sold, housed, clothed, fed, and protected as cattle, end quote. To quote Louise Michel, open quote, the first thing that must change is the relationship between the sexes. Humanity has two parts, men and women, and we ought to be walking hand in hand. Instead, there is antagonism, and it will last as long as the stronger half controls or think it controls the weaker half, end quote. Thus, anarchism, like feminism, fights patriarchy and for women's equality. Both share much common history and a concern about individual freedom, equality, and dignity for members of the female sex. Although, as we will explain in more depth below, anarchists have always been very critical of mainstream liberal feminism as not going far enough. Therefore, it is unsurprising that the new wave of feminism of the 60s expressed itself in an anarchist manner and drew much inspiration from anarchist figures such as Emma Goldman. Kathy Levin points out that during this time, open quote, independent groups of women began functioning without the structure, leaders, and other factotums of the male left, creating independently and simultaneously organizations similar to those of anarchists of many decades and regions. No accident either, end quote. It is no accident because, as feminist scholars have noted, women were among the first victims of hierarchical society, which is thought to have begun with the rise of patriarchy and ideologies of domination during the late Neolithic era. Marilyn French argues in Beyond Power that the first major social stratification of the human race occurred when men began dominating women, with women becoming, in effect, a lower and inferior social class. The links between anarchism and modern feminism exist in both ideas and action. Leading feminist thinker Carol Pateman notes that her, open quote, discussion on contract theory and its authoritarian and patriarchal basis owes something to libertarian ideas, that is, the anarchist wing of the socialist movement, end quote. Moreover, she noted in the 1980s how the major locus of criticism of authoritarian, hierarchical, undemocratic forms of organization for the last 20 years has been the women's movement. After Marx defeated Bakunin in the First International, the prevailing form of organization in the labor movement, the nationalized industries, and in the left sects have mimicked the hierarchy of the state. The women's movement has rescued and put into practice the long-submerged idea of anarchists like Bakunin that movements for and experiments in social change must prefigure the future form of social organization, end quote. Peggy Korniger has drawn attention to these strong connections between feminism and anarchism, both in theory and practice. Open quote. The radical feminist perspective is almost pure anarchism, she writes. The basic theory postulates the nuclear family as the basis of all authoritarian systems. The lesson the child learns from the father to teacher to boss to God is to obey the great anonymous voice of authority. To graduate from childhood to adulthood is to become a full-fledged automaton, incapable of questioning or even of thinking clearly, end quote. Similarly, the Zero Collective argues that Anarcha-Feminism, open quote, consists in recognizing the anarchism of feminism and consciously developing it, end quote. Anarcha-feminists point out that authoritarian traits and values, for example, domination, exploitation, aggressiveness, competitiveness, desensitization, etc., are highly valued in hierarchical civilizations and are traditionally referred to as masculine. In contrast, non-authoritarian traits and values such as cooperation, sharing, compassion, sensitivity, warmth, etc. are traditionally regarded as feminine and are devalued. Feminist scholars have traced this phenomenon back to the growth of patriarchal societies during the early Bronze Age and their conquest of cooperatively based organic societies in which feminine traits and values were prevalent and respected. Following these conquests, however, such values came to be regarded as inferior, especially for a man, since men were in charge of domination and exploitation under patriarchy. See, for example, Ryan Esler, The Callus and the Blade, or Elise Boulding, The Underside of History. Hence, anarcha-feminists have referred to the creation of a non-authoritarian anarchist society based on cooperation, sharing, mutual aid, etc., as the feminization of society. Anarcha-feminists have noted that feminizing society cannot be achieved without both self-management and decentralization. This is because the patriarchal authoritarian values and traditions they wish to overthrow are embodied and reproduced in hierarchies. Thus, feminism implies decentralization, which in turn implies self-management. Many feminists have recognized this as reflected in their experiments with collective forms of feminist organizations that eliminate hierarchical structure and competitive forms of decision-making. Some feminists have even argued that directly democratic organizations are specifically female political forms. See, for example, Nancy Hartzog's Feminist Theory and the Development of Revolutionary Strategy in Zyla Eisenstein's Capitalist Patriarchy and the Case for Socialist Feminism, pages 56 to 77. Like all anarchists, anarcha-feminists recognize that self-liberation is the key to women's equality and thus freedom. Thus, Emma Goldman, open quote, her development, her freedom, her independence must come from and through herself. First, by asserting herself as a personality and not as a sex commodity. Second, by refusing the right of anyone over her body, by refusing to bear children unless she wants them, by refusing to be a servant to God, the state, society, the husband, the family, etc., by making her life simpler, but deeper and richer. That is, by trying to learn the meaning and substance of life in all its complexities, by freeing herself from the fear of public opinion and public condemnation. End quote. Anarcha-feminism tries to keep feminism from becoming influenced and dominated by authoritarian ideologies of either the right or left. It proposes direct action and self-help instead of the massed reformist campaigns favored by the official feminist movement, with its creation of hierarchical and centralist organizations and its illusion that having more women bosses, politicians, and soldiers is a move towards equality. Anarcha-feminists would point out that the so-called management science which women have to learn in order to become managers in capitalist companies is essentially a set of techniques for controlling and exploiting wage workers in corporate hierarchies, whereas feminizing society requires the elimination of capitalist wage slavery and managerial domination altogether. Anarcha-feminists realize that learning how to become an effective exploiter or oppressor is not the path to equality. As one member of the Mujeres Libres put it, open quote, we did not want to substitute a feminist hierarchy for a masculine one, end quote. Also see section B.1.4 for further discussion on patriarchy and hierarchy. Hence anarchism's traditional hostility to liberal or mainstream feminism while supporting women's liberation and equality. Federica Montseny, a leading figure in the Spanish anarchist movement, argued that such feminism advocated equality for women but did not challenge existing institutions. She argued that mainstream feminism's only ambition is to give to women of a particular class the opportunity to participate more fully in the existing system of privilege, and if these institutions, open quote, are unjust when men take advantage of them, they will still be unjust if women take advantage of them, end quote. Thus, for anarchists, women's freedom did not mean an equal chance to become a boss or a wage slave, a voter or a politician, but rather to be a free and equal individual cooperating as equals in free associations. Open quote, feminism, stressed Peggy Korniger, doesn't mean female corporate power or a woman president. It means no corporate power and no presidents. The Equal Rights Amendment will not transform society. It only gives women the right to plug into a hierarchical economy. Challenging sexism means challenging all hierarchy, economic, political, and personal. And that means an anarcha-feminist revolution, end quote. Anarchism, as can be seen, included a class and economic analysis which is missing from mainstream feminism, while at the same time showing an awareness to domestic and sex-based power relations which eluded the mainstream socialist movement. This flows from our hatred of hierarchy. As Mazzoni put it, open quote, anarchy defends the cause of all the oppressed, and because of this, and in a special way, it defends your women's cause. O women doubly oppressed by present society in both the social and private spheres, end quote. This means that, to quote a Chinese anarchist, what anarchists, open quote, mean by equality between the sexes is not just that the men will no longer oppress women. We also want men to no longer be oppressed by other men, and women no longer to be oppressed by other women. Thus, women should completely overthrow rulership, force men to abandon all their special privileges and become equal to women, and make a world with neither the oppression of women nor the oppression of men." End quote. So, in the historic anarchist movement, as Martha Acklesberg notes, liberal/mainstream feminism was considered as being, open quote, too narrowly focused as a strategy for women's emancipation. Sexual struggle could not be separated from class struggle or from the anarchist project as a whole. End quote. Anarcha-Feminism continues this tradition by arguing that all forms of hierarchy are wrong, not just patriarchy, and that feminism is in conflict with its own ideals if it desires simply to allow women to have the same chance of being a boss as a man does. They simply state the obvious, namely that they, open quote, do not believe that power in the hands of women could possibly lead to a non-coercive society, nor do they believe that anything good can come out of a mass movement with a leadership elite. The central issues are always power and social hierarchy, and so people are free only when they have power over their own lives. End quote. For if, as Louise Michel put it, open quote, a proletarian is a slave, the wife of a proletarian is even more of a slave, end quote, ensuring that the wife experiences an equal level of oppression as the husband misses the point. Anarcha-feminists, therefore, like all anarchists, oppose capitalism as a denial of liberty. Their critique of hierarchy in society does not start and end with patriarchy. It is a case of wanting freedom everywhere, of wanting to, open quote, break up every home that rests in slavery, every marriage that represents the sale and transfer of the individuality of one of its parties to the other, every institution, social or civil, that stands between man and his right, every tie that renders one a master, another a serf, end quote. The ideal that an equal opportunity capitalism would free women ignores the fact that any such system would still see working class women oppressed by bosses, be they male or female. For anarcha-feminists, the struggle for women's liberation cannot be separated from the struggle against hierarchy as such. As L. Susan Brown puts it, open quote, anarchist feminism as an expression of the anarchist sensibility applied to feminist concerns takes the individual as its starting point and, in opposition to relations of domination and subordination, argues for non-instrumental economic forms that preserve individual existential freedom for both men and women. End quote. Anarcha-feminists have much to contribute to our understanding of the origins of the ecological crisis in the authoritarian values of hierarchical civilization. For example, a number of feminist scholars have argued that the domination of nature has paralleled the domination of women, who have been identified with nature throughout history. See, for example, Carolyn Merchant's The Death of Nature, 1980. Both women and nature are victims of the obsession with control that characterizes the authoritarian personality. For this reason, a growing number of both radical ecologists and feminists are recognizing that hierarchies must be dismantled in order to achieve their respective goals. In addition, anarcha-feminism reminds us of the importance of treating women equally with men, while at the same time respecting women's differences from men. In other words, that recognizing and respecting diversity includes women as well as men. Too often, many male anarchists assume that because they are in theory opposed to sexism, they are not sexist in practice. Such an assumption is false. Anarcha-feminism brings the question of consistency between theory and practice to the front of social activism and reminds us all that we must fight not only external constraints, but also internal ones. This means that anarcha-feminism urges us to practice what we preach. As Voltairine de Cleyre argued, open quote, I never expect men to give us liberty. No, women, we are not worth it until we take it. This involves insisting on a new code of ethics founded on the law of equal freedom, a code recognizing the complete individuality of woman. By making rebels wherever we can, By ourselves living our beliefs, we are revolutionists. And we shall use propaganda by speech, deed, and most of all, life, being what we teach. Thus, anarcha-feminists, like all anarchists, see the struggle against patriarchy as being a struggle of the oppressed for their own self-liberation. For, as a class, I have nothing to hope from men. No tyrant ever renounced his tyranny until he had to. If history ever teaches us anything, it teaches this. Therefore, my hope lies in creating rebellion in the breasts of women." End quote. This was sadly as applicable within the anarchist movement as it was outside it in patriarchal society. Faced with the sexism of male anarchists who spoke of sexual equality, women anarchists in Spain organized themselves into the Mujeres Libres organization to combat it. They did not believe in leaving their liberation to some day after the revolution. Their liberation was an integral part of that revolution and had to be started today. In this, they repeated the conclusions of anarchist women in Illinois coal towns who grew tired of hearing their male comrades shout in favor of sexual equality in the future society while doing nothing about it in the here and now. They used a particularly insulting analogy, comparing their male comrades to priests who, open quote, make false promises to the starving masses that there will be rewards in paradise. They argued that mothers should make their daughters understand that the difference in sex does not imply inequality in rights, and that as well as being rebels against the social system of today, they should fight especially against the oppression of men who would like to retain women as their moral and material inferior. End quote. They formed the Louisa Michel group to fight against capitalism and patriarchy in the upper Illinois Valley coal towns over 3 decades before their Spanish comrades organized themselves. For anarcha-feminists, combating sexism is a key aspect of the struggle for freedom. It is not, as many Marxist socialists argued before the rise of feminism, a diversion from the real struggle against capitalism, which would somehow be automatically solved after the revolution. It is an essential part of the struggle. Open quote. We do not need any of your titles. We want none of them. What we do want is knowledge and education and liberty. We know what our rights are and we demand them. Are we not standing next to you fighting the supreme fight? Are you not strong enough men to make part of that supreme fight a struggle for the rights of women? And then men and women together will gain the rights of all humanity. End quote. A key part of this revolutionizing modern society is the transformation of the current relationship between the sexes. Marriage is a particular evil for, open quote, the old form of marriage based on the Bible, till death doth part, is an institution that stands for the sovereignty of the man over the women, of her complete submission to his whims and commands. Women are reduced to the function of man's servant and bearer of his children. End quote. Instead of this, anarchists proposed free love, that is, couples and families based on free agreement between equals, rather than one partner being an authority and the other simply obeying. Such unions would be without sanction of church or state, for, open quote, two beings who love each other do not need permission from a third to go to bed. End quote. Equality and freedom apply to more than just relationships. For, open quote, if social progress consists in a constant tendency towards the equalization of the liberties of social units, then the demands of progress are not satisfied so long as half society, women, is in subjection. Woman is beginning to feel her servitude, that there is a requisite acknowledgement to be won from her master before he is put down and she exalted to equality. This acknowledgement is the freedom to control her own person. End quote. Neither men nor state nor church should say what a woman does with her body. A logical extension of this is that women must have control over their own reproductive organs. Thus, anarcha-feminists, like anarchists in general, are pro-choice and pro-reproductive rights. i.e. the right of a woman to control her own reproductive decisions. This is a long-standing position. Emma Goldman was persecuted and incarcerated because of her public advocacy of birth control methods and the extremist notion that women should decide when they become pregnant. As feminist writer Margaret Anderson put it, open quote, in 1916, Emma Goldman was sent to prison for advocating that women need not always keep their mouth shut and their wombs open. End quote. Anarcha-Feminism does not stop there. Like anarchism in general, it aims at changing all aspects of society, not just what happens in the home. For, as Goldman asked, open quote, how much independence is gained if the narrowness and lack of freedom of the home is exchanged for the narrowness and lack of freedom of the factory, sweatshop, department store, or office? Thus, women's equality and freedom had to be fought everywhere and defended against all forms of hierarchy. Nor can they be achieved by voting. Real liberation, argued anarcha-feminists, is only possible by direct action, and anarcha-feminism is based on women's self-activity and self-liberation, for while the right to vote or equal civil rights may be good demands, true emancipation begins neither at the polls nor in the courts. It begins in women's soul. Her freedom will reach as far as her power to achieve freedom reaches. End quote. The history of the women's movement proves this. Every gain has come from below by the action of women themselves. As Louise Michel put it, open quote, we women are not bad revolutionaries. Without begging anymore, we are taking our place in the struggles. Otherwise, we could go ahead and pass motions until the world ends and gain nothing. End quote. If women waited for others to act for them, their social position would never have changed. This includes getting the vote in the first place. Faced with the militant suffrage movement for women's votes, British anarchist Rose Whitcup recognized that it was, open quote, true that this movement shows us that women who so far have been so submissive to their masters, the men, are beginning to wake up at last to the fact that they are not inferior to those masters. Yet she argued that women would not be freed by votes but by their own strength. End quote. The women's movement of the 1960s and 1970s showed the truth of that analysis. In spite of equal voting rights, women's social place had remained unchanged since the 1920s. Ultimately, as anarchist Lily Gare Wilkinson stressed, the open quote, call for votes can never be a call to freedom. For what is to vote? To vote is to register assent to being ruled by one legislator or another. It does not get to the heart of the problem, namely hierarchy and the authoritarian social relationships it creates, of which patriarchy is only a subset of. Only by getting rid of all bosses, political, economic, social, and sexual, can genuine freedom for women be achieved and, open quote, make it possible for women to be human in the truest sense. Everything within her that craves assertion and activity should reach its fullest expression. All artificial barriers should be broken, and the road towards greater freedom cleared of every trace of centuries of submission and slavery. End quote.